The Lunar Lander project, tell us how that panned out.
So, right after the end of the first X Prize, NASA, I think to its great credit, had set up its own prize organization. They had sort of recognized that there was no reason this model, which X Prize Foundation had proven or had reproven, it was an old model, had sort of modernized, there's no reason it couldn't work for NASA. And so they, I think, showed this tremendous vision, and Congress enabled them to do so in creating their own prize program called Centennial Challenges. And they went out and they were looking to do a number of different technology prizes that sort of aided all the different mission areas for NASA. And this is at a time when Constellation was quite young and the agency was focused on getting back to the moon, and recognized that that was several years down the road, but also recognized that this field of vertical takeoff, vertical landing rocketry was relatively immature. And the work that had been done, the fantastic work that had been done by Grumman and others on the Apollo LEM had been sitting on the shelf for quite some time. So I think they, in partnership with X Prize, said, why don't we stir the pot a little bit and provide a little bit of incentive for some new kinds of people to be testing out vertical takeoff, vertical landing rocketry, to be making some mistakes, learning some lessons, and ultimately to be building vehicles that won't necessarily be going to the moon themselves, but will be really unique assets in terms of test platforms for us to make the mistakes and for us to learn the improvements and learn the lessons and learn the control systems for how to build the next lunar lander. So for the small amount of money, $2 million, they ended up getting something like a dozen teams to spend 20 times more than the prize value or so, building, I think there ended up being 9 or 10 different vehicles that actually flew, and another dozen vehicles that were designed on paper and made some progress. And not all those vehicles flew for a huge amount of time, but this is a field where, if you could, before that project was started, you could count the number of vertical takeoff, vertical landing rockets on one hand. It was the Apollo LEM, it was the DCX, and there was a Japanese program that was starting right around the same time. And Blue Origin was maybe just getting started right around the same time as well. So to go from 3 or 4 to now dozens of vehicles in dozens of different configurations with different propellant choices, different numbers of engines, different guidance boxes, I think was a really revolutionary thing. I think NASA got tremendous return on their value, and it helped identify some real talent in terms of individuals and companies that really sprung out of the woodwork to pursue this prize and proved that with a small budget and a lean team, they could do some really incredible things.
Brockert, Maston.
Yeah, Ben Brockert from Maston, now Armadillo. The whole gang at Armadillo, the whole gang at Maston. And then also, these true underdog stories, folks like Paul Breed from Unreasonable Rocket, or Scott and Todd from this team called True Zero. I mean, look at those guys. These are two guys, a mechanical engineer and an electrical engineer. They're the type of people who just like to do projects for the fun of it, not necessarily for commercialization, but they had built an electric car and a go-kart and all these kind of things, had never thought about doing rocketry, read about this prize in the newspaper and say, hey, well, we just finished a project, we were looking for something, how hard could rockets be? And go in under a year from never having thought about building a rocket to flying a rocket under an FAA permit in front of an audience and making, a history-making flight. They didn't win the prize, but damn if they didn't do something incredibly impressive. And Paul, another great story, father-son team operating on the definition of a shoestring budget, just strips the problems down to the absolute most simple way that you could possibly phrase them and builds this truly elegant little rocket and does some amazing things. I think things that we had savvy veterans from NASA and from the Air Force, our judging panel, who had a century of rocketry experience between them, just jaws dropping to see one guy out there, 2 guys out there conducting rocket operations on a vehicle that they designed and built themselves. I think it was really eye-opening. I hope it was really inspiring, certainly to students to see that, but also I think to veterans in the field to sort of say, hey, look, they're not building the space shuttle, they're not building an Atlas V, but they're building something that's significant, and they're doing it on no time and no money. I think was an eye-opener for a lot of people.
What is it about a prize that brings that out in people, and what kind of insights have you gotten out of it?
I remember one of my favorite parts of the prize design process when I was at X Prize is when we thought we had an idea and we were trying to it was still rough around the edges, we were trying to hone it. Usually we would do this series of phone calls with CEOs and with relevant government people and hopefully if we could find it with some potential financiers and sort of say, hey, we're thinking of doing a prize like this, and what do you suggest the rules should be like, and who do you think would compete, and how long would it take to learn? And one thing I learned in specific when we were developing the Google Lunar X Prize was we would call these people, and serious, real people, and call them and say, hey, we're thinking about doing a prize, And the rules might be something like, and describe the Google Lunar X Prize rules. What do you think it would cost? How big do you think the prize purse would have to be in order for people to compete? And the statistical average of what people said for that was about $75 million, right? So then that would be at the beginning of an hour-long phone call, and then I'd ask a number of technical questions about, should it move or not, and half a kilometer or 5 kilometers or what, and blah, 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 and sort of bother them up with all these questions. And then at the end of the call, I'll say, well, confidentially, we might be about to announce this prize, and we might be doing it in a month, and it might be only for, a quarter of the value of what you said, or a third of the value. And they would all say, I'm in. It was this act of waving even hypothetical dollars in front of somebody's nose just gets people excited. It focuses the senses in this very sharp way. There's this historical fact that, generally speaking, teams competing for incentive prizes like the X Prize and like many that preceded it, usually spend about 2.5 times the prize value trying to win the prize. And they do that because the prize is something that hooks their emotions. It gets them excited about it. It gets their spouse excited about it. It gets their employees excited about it. But they also recognize that in winning the prize, they don't just win the cash. They win the admiration and the attention of the world. And if you have an idea that is unusual relative to what the rest of the industry is doing, that is sort of by definition out of the box, there's no better way to prove it than by doing it. And the prize can be an excuse to go out and do it and to have the media of the world paying attention and to go from being someone no one's ever heard of to the best credentialed person essentially overnight.